Hi everyone, welcome to this session. The objective of this session is to discuss the independence of central banks, and in this session more specifically we will discuss what are the case for independence and what are the case against independence, and after that we will review the independence of some of the well known banks across the globe. So, coming to the independence of central bank, there are various dimensions of independence of central bank. One is goal independence. So, the goal independence means it encompasses those institutional characteristics that insulate the central bank from political influence in defining its monetary policy objectives. That is one. For example, the goals, for example, price stability, interest rate stability, and at the same time that the growth in GDP, employment level, foreign exchange stability, etc. So, this in setting this goal, whether or prioritizing, for example, inflation over economic growth or economic growth over inflation. So, whether the central banks having this goal independence, that is one dimension, and another dimension is selecting the instrument independence, that is the ability, it refers to the ability of the central bank to freely implement policy instruments in its pursuit to meet its monetary policy goals. So, among the monetary policy tools, for example, open market operation, between open market operations and the discount window, whether they can apply the tools as per the wish of the central bank or not. For example, discount window, if they reduce the discount rate, you know that the banks can borrow more and the liquidity of the banking system will increase, and at the same time it also increase the liquidity in the economy, money supply in the economy will increase. So, similarly another tool, for example, cash reserve ratio, increasing the reserve requirement or reducing the reserve requirement is not only affect the liquidity in the bank, it also affects the profitability or the investment opportunities of the banking system. For example, increasing the reserve requirement, you know that the money with the banking system will come down, that means the net income, the income that is available out of the total deposits, the amount, the fund available with the banking system will come down. That means they have to keep, for example, from 10%, what if they increase it into from 10 to 15%, then that means of the total liabilities, demand and time liabilities, then that means the fund available with the banking system to make investment in, for example, giving loans or investing in securities will come down, and then that will affect the profitability of the banking system as a whole, which has further implication about the entire financial system and also overall economic growth as well. So, that means choosing between these goals, for example, open market operations and discount rate and cash reserve requirement plus so many other qualitative tools, whether do the central bank have the freedom, do they have the freedom to choose which tools to use, that is another dimension. Then the further dimension, these are the two key dimensions. In addition, there are other dimensions, other measures of independence of central banks. That is, one is called functional and operational independence. So, to achieve its mandate, the central bank, it refers to that the central bank, whether the central bank has the authority to run its own operation. That means without depending on the government, whether it can appoint its own staff, it can appoint staff, setting budgets and so on by its own, without relying on the government, and to organize its internal structures without excessive involvement of government. And the fourth one is called the financial independence. So, here central bank enjoying financial independence, those banks will have full autonomy on their budget, and some are even prohibited from financing governments. So, this meant to remove incentive from politicians to influence central bank. That means central bank is having complete full financial independence, that means full autonomy on their budget. The fifth one is called the legal independence, that means some central banks have their own legal personality which allows them to ratify international agreements without the government's approval. For example, European Central Bank, and they can also to go to the court. For example, the example here is European Central Bank. So that means they enjoy legal independence. So this also, the important is that if all these key dimensions, if they enjoy independence in all these dimensions, then you can say that the central bank is fully independent, and the monetary policy that they are designing and implementing, it will be fully decided by or it is independent from the government. It is independent from the government. So these are the dimensions, and there are some arguments for case for independence and case against independence. So the strongest case for independence is that the strongest argument for an independent central bank rests on the view that subjecting it to more political pressures would impart an inflationary bias to monetary policy. So that means political pressure would impart an inflationary bias to monetary policy. That is the key arguments of key case for independence. There is the concept called business cycle. So especially before and after the election. So especially during the election time, you know that mostly, suppose if the central bank is not independent, is more related to the, that means the central bank is under the control of the government, then you can see that especially during the election time, what is the objective function of the politician, especially you know that they want to, when they want to gain score more votes, so you know that in order to win the election they will be following more populist policies. Maybe they will be doing, especially at the time of election, they prefer to have an expansionary monetary policy. That means expansionary monetary policy means low interest rate. Low interest rate means for the firms, you know that the firms will be happy with a low interest rate because the cost of borrowing will come down, then the employment opportunity, they will borrow more from the markets and they will engage more in economic activity, that means production of goods and services, which would lead to high employment and high GDP. Right. So similarly, low interest rates for consumers, somebody is taking mortgage loan or taking other consumer loans, durable consumer loans, and all this will benefit, all this will trend a positive signal in the economy, that means the economic activity will increase. So however, you know that that is one, that the low interest rate they will be preferring, that is one. Then another thing is that during election times, governments will be interested to, they will be following an expansionary fiscal policy, that means more government expenditure, and more government expenditure especially in the social sector, to more populist fiscal policy they will be following at that time, increasing government expenditure, at that same time cutting government taxes, right. So then in order to finance this fiscal policy, fiscal expenditure, government will be monetizing the budget deficit. Suppose if the central bank is under the control of the government, you can see that during election time there will be expansionary fiscal policy, and this expansionary fiscal policy, the finance required for this fiscal policy will be raised through printing more currencies, injecting more money in the economy, that means monetizing the budget deficit, by printing more currency or borrowing more from the market. So that means there will be monetizing this budget deficit, then leading to low rate of interest. So at the time of election, what you can say that it will lead to low interest rate, but afterwards you know that when the liquidity in the economy increase. When the liquidity increase, that means when they are injecting the increase in the liquidity, that means high money supply in the economy. High money supply, eventually it will lead to inflation. So then you see, when there is an inflation in the economy, that means it also just had the Fisher effect. That means when inflation is increasing, the nominal rate of interest also will increase, right, because the demand is in the market, the demand is the investors in the finance market, those who lend their money in the finance market, they are looking at the real interest rate. So when the inflation increases, then the nominal rate of interest has to be increased. So what we can see, normally it has been observed that there is political business cycle. That means during election time, there the economic activity, due to expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, the economic activity will increase, but the after effect, the adverse effect, for example increase in inflation, which would eventually lead to hyperinflation and also leading to high interest rate, this would happen due to the political business cycle. And the case for independence, those who argue for independence of the central bank state that they state that if we give if you reduce the independence of the central bank, there is high possibility for political business cycle. So because of that, it is better to give more independence to the central bank in order to avoid political business cycle. So here again the point I just mentioned here, I am just showing here in the slide. That means treasury financing through large budget deficit, that the accommodative monetary policy, that also would lead to political business cycle. So another point, related point is too important to leave to politicians. That means the principal agent problem is worse for politicians. Actually politicians, especially many arguments, those who argue for the advocates of independence for central bank, they believe that politicians, they are short sighted, they are actually, their time span is actually nearly 5 years or maximum 10 years, but then actually all their policy, that they are the fiscal policy, and accordingly using monetary policy in their advantage, will be looking at a short time period, which won't be at the best interest of the economy. So the principal agent problem is worse for politicians. So that is the case for independence. Then another thing is against independence is that the proponents of Fed under the control of the President or Congress argue that it is undemocratic to have monetary policy controlled by an elite group that is responsible to no one. Here the main argument is that against independence of the central bank is that macroeconomic stability can be best achieved if monetary policy is properly coordinated with fiscal policy, because the two major forms of economic policy in a domestic economy, that one is monetary policy, the other one is fiscal policy. So those who argue against independence says that macroeconomic stability can be best achieved if monetary policy is properly coordinated with fiscal policy. Since government is responsible for the macroeconomic performance of the country, the opponents of independence argue that it must have some degree of control over the monetary policy. The opponents also argue that central banks are not necessarily immune from political pressure. So here let us see the theory of bureaucratic behavior also affects. So before that, so the main point is that this is undemocratic, and another point is that actually the elite group, especially the monetary authority, they are not democratically elected people, they are not accountable, they are unaccountable to the general public. and plus some more points which we just discussed. Difficult to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy if the central bank is independent. Actually, to attain the long term goals of the economy, that the economic growth, money, inflation, price stability, employment, foreign exchange rate stability, etc., both fiscal and monetary policy should go together. However, if it is independent, it is difficult to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy. You know, fiscal policy is mainly by the central government, monetary policies by the central bank. So, examples also, empirical evidences also, the proponents against the people against independence argue that has not used independence successfully. One of the theory explaining the behavior of the central bank is the government bureaucratic behavior. That means the bureaucrats serve the public interest. That is the public interest view. So, one view they say that okay, they serve the purpose, they serve the interest of the public interest. However, some economists have developed a theory of bureaucratic behavior that suggests that other factors that influence how bureaucracies operate. So, the theory of bureaucracy behavior may be a useful guide to predicting what motivates the Fed and other central banks in its operation. So, the theory of bureaucratic behavior states that the objective of the bureaucrats is to maximize its own welfare, which is related to power and prestige. That means officials of the central bank, who can be called as also called as the bureaucratic as per this framework, their objective as according to this theory is that to maximize their own welfare, which is related to power and prestige. So, they fight vigorously to preserve their autonomy. They also avoid conflict with more powerful groups in the economy. So, in this case what is happening is that according to this theory, it suggests that the objective of the bureaucracy is to maximize its own welfare, akin to consumers' behavior that aims at maximizing personal welfare. So, that means the central bank can pursue a course of narrow self interest to increase its power and prestige at the expense of public interest. So, looking at this clearly, based on this theory, it is argued that it is better not to give more independence for the central bank because bureaucrats will try to maximize their own welfare. However, some economists, they do not rule out altruism, though people do charity for feel good. This also result in some good in society. So, when it comes to the degree of the independence, whether independence, the central bank independence, whether it is good for the economy or not, there are lots of research has been happening on this area. One research shows that especially with related to the goal of price stability or inflation. Look at this diagram, that is the level of degree of independence that is measured on the x axis, here. That means our rankings from least independent, from that 0 from here to here, more independent. So, you can see that when the degree of independence increase, those countries with high degree of independence, they are having less inflation. So, you can see that when we are moving to the rightward axis, you can see that these countries they are having less inflation. When we move to less degree, that the degree of independence come down, then you can see that the inflation is very high. This is one indicator. Some more studies have happened. There are several studies. One study looking at the central bank's independence and macroeconomic performance by Alesina and Summers. Their main point, they examine the degree of central bank degree of central bank independence, which varies considerably across countries according to their study as per their estimates. Several authors, what they argue, they took several authors studies, they reviewed and say that found that more independent central banks are associated with the lower levels of inflation. So, what we have seen in the previous figure, that means more independent the central banks are, then that means it is associated with the lower levels of inflation, because we normally from a consumer perspective and also policy perspective, a mild inflation is better for the country, better for the economy. So, that means more independent the central bank is, there is low levels of inflation. However, the relationship between central bank independence and the level of variability in real economic variables such as growth, unemployment and real interest, that is less investigated. And this study, they argue that they found that their conclusion is that while central bank independence promotes price stability, however, it has no measurable impact on real economic performance. That means real economic variables such as economic growth, unemployment rate and real interest rate. This study they couldn't find a clear cut impact. However, most of the study they agree that central bank independence has a very clear cut predictable impact on price stability. Let us now review the independence of some select central bank across the globe. First of all, about the Fed, how independent is Fed. So, you can see that you might have already got the clear idea in the previous sessions. We can say that when it comes to monetary policy instruments such as selecting open market operation, discount rate and reserve requirements, as well as the interest rate on reserve requirements, the Fed reserve system enjoy full autonomy. Similarly, goal independence, looking at whether the goal is inflation, price stability or economic growth, there also the Fed enjoys full autonomy. That means it is not subject to approval by federal government. So, overall in addition to that, you can also see that the Fed is having independent revenue as well. However, you can see that the Fed structure is written by the Congress and is subject to change at any time, and also you can see that there is presidential influence, that the influence on Congress, and that means appointing members and appointing chairman, although the terms are not concurrent with the president. So, the important point here is that the key bodies within the Federal Reserve System are the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve and the FOMC, that the Federal Open Market Committee, and that we have discussed in the previous classes, that is the Board of Governors is composed of 7 governors appointed by the President of the United States. So, in that way you can say that okay, the government intervention is there. However, an important feature of the Federal Reserve structure is that, in particular of that of FOMC, is the considerable degree of independence given to the monetary policy making authority. The 14-year term for which governors are appointed and the fact that they cannot be reappointed provide insulation from the political process. So, one more thing, the chairman of the Board of Governors is appointed for a 4-year term. The chairman of the Board of Governors is appointed for a 4-year term, but this term is not concurrent with that of the President of the United States. So, therefore, an incoming president does not immediately get to appoint his choice of chairman, nor can he dismiss them if he disagrees with their policy actions. So, similarly, the other members of the FOMC, the regional bank presidents, are appointed by the directors of the regional banks with the approval of the Board of Governors. So, what we can see that overall we can see that there is a trend towards greater independence across the globe for many central banks, because of the high correlation between macroeconomic stability and independent central banks has led to remarkable trend to further enhance the independence of central banks across the world. Many of the drawbacks that we have discussed, it has already been, most of them has been tackled, and in order to ensure that central banks do not deviate from the overall socio-economic goals of the nation, most central banks have been made accountable to their parliaments and are required to become more transparent about their operations by publishing minutes of their decisive meetings and communicating their policies to the public. So, you can see this one in India as well. India's monetary policy, whenever Indian Monetary Policy Committee meets, they are also mandated to publish the minutes of the meeting as well, and also asked to state the reason for why they vote for and why they vote against the decisions. So, the Federal Reserve has historically been more independent than almost all the other central bank. So, we can see that other central banks, for example, European Central Bank is one of the most independent central banking system in the world, most independent in the world. So, about the European Central Bank, there are 19 national central banks of the euro area. They are also considered as one of these banks. European Central Bank is also considered as one of the most independent in the world. So, about other banks, Banks of Canada, they essentially control the monetary policy. They have control over the tools as well as the goals of monetary policy. In addition, Bank of England, they have really more and more independence. They enjoy high level of independence. Bank of Japan also recently gained more independence. So, what we can see that recently more central banks that have been traditionally subject to intervention of finance ministries, for example, Bank of England and Bank of Japan, they have been granted more independence since the 90s. About People's Bank of China, though they enjoyed a little bit a degree of independence, however, it comes directly under the government. And coming to India, you know that Reserve Bank of India is not a constitutional body, it's only a statutory body. It was established through the Reserve Bank of India Act 1935. Although RBI has considerable institutional independence, it is under the control of Ministry of Finance, that the government of India. So, we can see that when it comes to the selection of the monetary policy instrument, we can see that the Reserve Bank of India enjoys independence, but when it comes to the goals, there have been some clashing points between the central government and the Reserve Bank of India. These are some newspaper clippings I am showing you just to show there are some clash points between government and the Reserve Bank of India. One of the thing is the interest rate, especially government at the central. Over time we have seen that especially during election time or crisis time, they have been asking for batting for reducing the rate of interest. However, Reserve Bank of India often resist because they anticipate reducing the rate of interest, that is injecting more money in the economy will lead to inflationary pressure in the economy. Another areas of disagreement is the dividend payments from the RBI to the government. Government has been asking for more dividends, but RBI is resistant. Similarly, in the case of prompt corrective action, RBI has recently increased in the scope of prompt corrective actions. It has many public sector banks are under the radar of the RBI, and where sometimes government has been objecting to it. Similarly, the reserve, especially the cash reserves with the central bank, sometimes the government has been eyeing the surplus reserve, arguing that most other central banks are not sitting on this kind of cash pile. However, RBI is unwilling to let go this kitty, as this is an important tool to manage exchange rate risk, as well as to ensure that banking crisis, in case there is banking crisis or bank failure, the central bank can use, RBI can use this fund in order to save the banking system, in order to rescue the banking system. So, in this session overall we have discussed the independence, what are the case for and against independence, and we have reviewed some countries, the independence of some of the central banks in the globe, across the globe. Thank you for watching this video, and we will see in the next session. Thank you.